Chapter 141, Home Sweet Home 2. Seeing Enar before her, Daenerys, who had many things to say after a year and a half apart, showed an unhappy expression. "I thought you weren't coming. After all, you've gone a year and a half without even sending a letter. Perhaps you had too much fun with some whore in Winterfell," said the girl, displaying a fierce expression as she looked at Enar. The smile on Enar's face stiffened at Daenerys' words. Lover? He hadn't had time to sleep in a year and a half. How could he have a lover? However, when he saw Daenerys' fierce expression, Enar felt like laughing. She was trying to look threatening, but to him that reaction was simply adorable. Enar took her in his arms and sat on the throne, pulling her onto his lap. Looking at the girl, he spoke in an amused tone. "You think too much. I've never had a mistress, although I have teased a few women." Daenerys was happy with the first part of the sentence, but the second made her glance dangerously at Enar. Who was the slut? She hated others coveting what was hers, especially women like Arianne and Rhaenys. Neither of them hid their interest in Enar. Especially Arianne, who could jump into Daenerys' husband's bed at any moment, without any hesitation. So jealous. "But I like it," Enar commented, kissing her cheek playfully. "Dangerous women are always the most attractive." Daenerys snorted at his words, but a smile formed on her lips. However, it soon disappeared when she realized that Enar was subtly manipulating her to divert the subject. Still, thinking about what was about to happen, she put her jealousy aside for a moment and told Enar what had happened. After hearing Daenerys' account, Enar narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Honestly, he couldn't see into the future 24 hours a day, 7 days a week and 12 years without stopping. That was impossible and would drive him mad. Among billions of timelines, he used his power to choose the ones that gave him the best decisions. However, each action, decision or indecision created infinite other possibilities. So, instead of saying that he knew what would happen in the future, it was more accurate to say that he saw infinite possibilities and could guide events towards what suited him best. Nothing in the world was immutable, not even fate. That's why he was surprised by the events that took place in King's Landing. "Since Robert gave me such a nice present, how could I refuse?" Enar commented with an amused tone. He really wanted to fight Robert more and more. The man he saw was worthy of facing him. "When you get to King's Landing, don't hesitate to kill all the Sparrow fanatics," Enar said to Daenerys, making the girl widen her eyes in surprise. "Won't that cause even more chaos?" Daenerys asked, shocked by Enar's decisive attitude in wanting to exterminate everyone. After all, they belonged to the Faith of the Seven, the largest religion in Westeros for almost 10,000 years. "Dear Queen, we won't be like Jaehaerys. There will be no peace or any agreement with the Faith of the Seven." Enar spoke with a murderous tone. "I won't be like Jaehaerys, who didn't avenge the assassination attempt on his own wife." Honestly, he really thought that Jaehaerys had a cold and calculating mind for having endured his wife's assassination attempt without reacting against the Faith of the Seven. If it had been Maegor or Visenya, Old Town would have been in flames the next day. Although he knew that Jaehaerys' decision had been a smart move to bring peace to the kingdom, Enar would have taken the opportunity to introduce the gods of ancient Valyria and make both religions face each other, while the king just watched as both consumed each other's strength, creating a balance. And when the Faith of the Seven was weakened years later, Enar would destroy it for good, eradicating the religion of the Undulls. But that would be if he were in Jaehaerys' place. At the moment, Enar didn't have the slightest patience for such elaborate schemes and chose the simplest and most brutal approach, to completely eradicate the influence of the Faith of the Seven in King's Landing. As for the people, Enar just scoffed. Like a true messiah, he wanted to see how the Faith of the Seven would dare to challenge him in the field of indoctrination. He had every confidence that he would win this ideological war. After all, he had the Bible and could perform real miracles in people's eyes. Daenerys looked at Enar with a sick, obsessive gleam in her eyes. She really loved it when her husband showed this murderous attitude. Just as Enar found dangerous women attractive, Daenerys felt the same fascination. "Don't worry, I'll bathe the great September of Baelor in the blood of all the Septans," Daenerys promised with an equally murderous tone. If Enar didn't mind causing more chaos, neither did she. Initially, she planned to eliminate these people more discreetly. But if Enar wanted to act publicly and decisively, then she would do exactly as he wanted. Enar couldn't help but show a pleased expression when she heard Daenerys' promise. The girl was not at all indecisive. "I have to go now. Remember to control the walls first and then gradually take control of the city. Enar said, stroking Daenerys' hair. I'll send Riella to King's Landing. Originally, he had planned to let his grandmother conquer Harrenhal, but changes in plans could always happen. He couldn't allow Daenerys to remain alone in King's Landing. The girl might be determined, but she was still too young to control a city of 500,000 people. Daenerys agreed with Enar's words. She understood why her mother was coming. King's Landing wasn't like Dragonstone. The city had 500,000 inhabitants and was definitely not easy to manage, especially without anyone to help her. Before you go, remember not to provoke other women, you womanizer. Daenerys spoke with a threatening tone, returning to the initial topic of conversation. Enar laughed and undid his projection, causing Daenerys to fall back onto her throne. I will make no promises, my dear queen. Enar let out those words before disappearing completely. Humph! Daenerys snorted, dissatisfied. She knew that Enar had only said that to provoke her and make her jealous again. She realized that he liked to see her jealous of other women. Bastard always likes to tease me. Daenerys grumbled, but a smile appeared on her lips. The news that Enar hadn't had a mistress in the last year and a half made her more than satisfied. However, remembering that Enar had teased a few women, Daenerys tried to remember who might be close to her husband, gradually creating a list of suspects. Arianne was at the top, followed by Kinvara and then Rhaenys. The reason Kinvara was ahead of Rhaenys was simple. The woman had no sense of shame or any shyness. If Enar wished, she would simply jump into his bed without hesitation. Rhaenys, on the other hand, was shy just like Visenya at the beginning of her relationship with Enar. Although that could change, it wouldn't be suddenly. Therefore, the two main suspects were Arianne and Kinvara. Humph! Daenerys gave her a scornful look and muttered, I have to discipline these women, or they'll think they can replace me and Visenya. She didn't want to be so drastic, but her older sister was too kind to take harsh measures against these women. Daenerys needed to make it clear that, whatever they did, none of them would ever be above her and Visenya. With a wicked grin, Daenerys almost let out a villainous laugh, like Enar's occasional smiles. But she held back. She didn't want to look like a villain like her husband. If Enar could read her thoughts, he would probably be dismayed. Although he was a complete villain, he still needed to keep up appearances of a good guy in the eyes of the world. During the army's march towards Gemini Castle, Enar opened his eyes and looked at his grandmother, who was riding alongside Rhaenys and other women. Holding his horse's reins, he approached. Grandma, change of plans, he said before whispering what he had just discovered. Riella's eyes widened as she heard her grandson's words. She opened her mouth in surprise. Not in her wildest dreams had she imagined that Robert would actually leave King's Landing. But when she heard that Daenerys was going to a city in complete chaos, Riella's face changed dramatically. She really wanted to hit her daughter at that moment. King's Landing had become a veritable hell on earth. How could a girl her age control a collapsing city on her own? Especially without a court to help her administer it. I'll go immediately. Riella spoke with a serious tone. At that moment, her only concern was to get to King's Landing as quickly as possible. Chapter 142, Home Sweet Home 3. Looking down, Daenerys saw the fleet of ships from Houses Targaryen and Velaryon crossing the sea, breaking the waves violently. Being very high up, she had the feeling that the warships were like wooden toys, but she knew that this was just an illusion caused by the distance. Even sending a raven to Montford Velaryon, the man took more than half a day to reach Dragonstone. Daenerys wasted no time. She mounted Balerion and flew through the skies towards the capital of the Seven Kingdoms. The fleet of Houses Targaryen and Velaryon followed the queen without hesitation. Many of these men wanted a war in King's Landing to gain fame, merit and glory. Balerion let out a loud roar and gradually descended. Daenerys smiled as she felt her dragon's excitement. He was just as excited as she was at that moment. He seemed to feel like he was coming home after a long time. After just a few minutes of flying, Daenerys finally glimpsed King's Landing. She couldn't help but hold her breath at the sight of the city on the coast. Although it wasn't as big as Volantis, Braavos, or any other free city, for her, King's Landing was far more beautiful than any other city. There, in the city built by House Targaryen, Daenerys felt she was finally seeing a true home. This would be the place where she would marry and raise her children, just like the ancient queens who came before her. A particularly high hill with a castle on top captured her attention completely. It was the highest hill, and at its summit, a red castle stood out even from a distance. The Red Keep, home to House Targaryen for more than 200 years since Aegon's conquest, had served as a dwelling for 17 kings over almost 3 centuries of dynasty. Sensing Daenerys' excitement, Balerion let out a loud, powerful roar. His black figure looked especially fearsome among all the dragons of House Targaryen, and indeed he was the most fearsome in appearance. With Balerion's speed, he was already flying over the city, passing dangerously close to the great September of Baelor. The city bells resounded everywhere. Balerion's roar had already alarmed countless people, and when those same people saw the black dragon, they all knew that the chaos had truly come to an end. The memory of the Crimson Dragon was still clear and vivid in the minds of the people. Countless people came out of their homes and raised their arms, as if asking for the savior to finally come and free them from the hell that had been these 2 days since Robert had left King's Landing. Daenerys made Balerion fly low enough so that she could see what the people were doing and understood that those 2 days had been truly tragic. But she didn't land in the city. She would only come down when her soldiers arrived in King's Landing. Not even Balerion could guarantee her safety in a city full of enemies who wanted her dead. Daenerys wouldn't be surprised if they tried to assassinate her on landing. Since she wasn't an arrogant fool who would risk her life on impulse, the queen remained flying over the city with the black dragon. She could hear the children's cries of joy at the sight of the dragon, causing her lips to curve into a gentle smile. Daenerys really wanted to land and greet her people, but she knew she couldn't at that moment. However, she could do something to calm the people of King's Landing. Balerion spat black and red flames into the air and then passed through the flames in a breathtaking spectacle for anyone watching. The inhabitants of King's Landing were familiar with displays of fire and dragons. The Crimson Dragon had done just that a year and a half ago. Unlike the grandeur of the huge red dragon, the black dragon in front of them was much more agile and swift, making the demonstration unique in comparison. Especially the children, who looked up at the dragon in the sky with eyes full of wonder. The fear and terror they had felt during those 2 days disappeared as if they had never existed. The adults weren't afraid of the dragon, on the contrary, relief washed over them. Seeing the dragon in the sky brought a comfort and security that made them feel at ease. As for the fact that House Targaryen had returned to reign in King's Landing, they didn't care. Robert's abandonment made every person in the city hate him more than anything. The hatred they felt for the monarch was as deep as the hatred the noble houses felt when they remembered Aerys too. Aerys, at least, never killed commoners, at least not until Jaime stopped him from blowing up King's Landing. Unlike Caraxes, Balerion wasn't so resistant. Then Daenerys made the dragon land on the roof of the great September of Baelor. Looking down at the city below, she smiled and calmly waited for her fleet of ships to arrive and disembark in King's Landing. Inside the September of Baelor, the High Sparrow was kneeling before 7 gigantic statues, his eyes closed as he continuously muttered his prayers to the gods. Even though the building shook with Balerion's landing, he didn't open his eyes. Only when he had finished his prayer did he open them. Looking at a Septan not far from him, the High Sparrow asked in a calm, gentle tone, "What happened, Brother Solom?" "According to the soldiers, a dragon has landed on the September." The Septan called Solom replied with a devout tone, while looking at the man with admiration in his eyes. "The incestuous monstrosity?" The High Sparrow asked, with a slightly colder tone than usual. "Yes." The Septan replied calmly. "It's probably Daenerys Targaryen. She's married to her own nephew." Solom couldn't help but show an expression of disgust at such a sinful marriage. He couldn't believe that there could be love between aunt and nephew. It was so immoral and evil that he felt a strong repulsion. The High Sparrow didn't hide his disgust either when he heard about the relationship between aunt and nephew. Putting this disgusting fact aside for a moment, he spoke with a deep tone. "She's probably come to conquer King's Landing." "What are we going to do?" Solom asked, worried. Although he hadn't seen the dragon mentioned by the soldiers, he had personally witnessed the Targaryen king's crimson dragon. He was sure that nothing could stop a beast of that size. The entire city was nothing more than a large immobile target for a dragon like that. So, even though he felt disgusted and repulsed by the woman, Solom didn't want to create animosity between the queen and the faith of the Seven. If she angered the girl, who could stop her from burning down Old Town in a fit of rage? "We won't do anything, we'll just wait." The High Sparrow replied calmly. It's not up to you or me to worry about the arrival of the incestuous abomination, it's up to those little nobles who don't own fiefdoms and live in the capital. Solem breathed a sigh of relief when he realized that the High Sparrow didn't want to cause any conflict with the Targaryen queen. Just as he had said, the Faith of the Seven didn't need to do anything, just as it hadn't done anything in over 7,000 years of history. Kingdoms have fallen, dynasties have collapsed, but the Faith of the Seven has remained untouched for almost 10,000 years. I will order the Faith militant not to cause trouble with Queen Targaryen, Solem said and turned away, walking towards the exit of the Great September of Baelor Hall. High Sparrow closed his eyes again, but instead of starting to pray he apparently muttered to himself. Lord, why are you testing my faith at this time? No matter how powerful the beast she controls, she's just an ignorant mortal from a barbarian civilization. She is not worthy of the Lord personally ordering me to kill her. He continued muttering. But if you wish her dead I will. She will suffer before death and I will make her believe in the Lord. The High Sparrow's voice rang out among the hall, but no voice responded to his words, but the man didn't care. All he cared about was fulfilling the mission given to him personally by the God of the Seven Faces. Chapter 143, Home Sweet Home 4. Daenerys was unaware that she was already the target of a fanatic and a god, who was gradually discovering Enar's dislike of the gods. However, even if the girl had known, she would have laughed and felt no fear. Enar had taught her not to be afraid and to face her fears head-on, because only when you overcome fear do you reach true maturity. Daenerys didn't have to wait more than a few hours for the ships of the Targaryen and Valyrian fleets to dock at the port. Montfort and Arryn climbed down a wooden plank to the ground, watching the gold-masked soldiers who were already in formation. They both looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Although they had seen these soldiers before, it was the first time they had seen them in action. And they had to admit that military discipline was truly enviable. All 1,500 men seemed to move as a single entity. Sardaukar! Merrick shouted loudly, and all the soldiers slammed their shields against the ground, producing a deafening roar. March towards the queen. He ordered his troops in a cold, calm tone. As soon as Merrick's words echoed, all 1,500 men stepped forward, holding their spears and shields firmly. Montfort and Arryn ordered their own soldiers to march together, but as they entered the city, both their faces changed dramatically. Even someone as experienced in warfare as Montfort couldn't help but feel nauseous at the brutal and bloody scene that stretched out before them. Dried blood stained some walls, while decomposing bodies could be seen in every alleyway. By the gods, Robert really is crazy. Montfort muttered at the sight of the carnage. He thought Aerys was insane, but Robert was proving even more insane by ordering something like this. Who, with a shred of humanity, could commit such an atrocity? What's this before the chance of winning a war? Unlike Montfort, Arryn was more realistic. He himself wouldn't hesitate to do something even worse in order to climb the ranks of the nobility. His brother would never understand the determination of someone truly cruel. However, Robert's decision did surprise him, but he soon accepted it as natural. After all, how could Robert be an ordinary man after declaring war on House Targaryen? Robert could be many things, but no one would dare say that he was an indecisive man. People looked at the soldiers marching through the streets of King's Landing with admiration in their eyes. To them, the soldiers in the golden masks seemed more powerful than the golden robes themselves, who had left King's Landing with Robert. The momentum, aura, and gestures of these warriors were so imposing that they made the golden robes look like a group of untrained bandits. When Daenerys saw the golden wave walking through the streets of King's Landing, she smiled and made Balerion let out a loud, powerful roar. Merrick looked up at the ceiling of the Great September of Baelor and saw the Queen's dragon perched atop the structure. Without hesitation, he ordered his troops to march towards the Great September of Baelor. He wouldn't dare leave the Queen unprotected for a second longer. At his rider's command, Balerion leapt into the air and flew off, landing gradually in the square in front of the September. Daenerys looked back and, in the center of the gleaming ivory square, saw the statue of King Baelor the Blessed. He stood tall and serene on a pedestal, his face sculpted in an expression of benevolence. She despised this ancestor with all her might. To her, Baelor was neither a king nor a dragon, but a slave to his own desires and thoughts, a prisoner in his own mind. Just an idiot held hostage by his own delusional mind. Daenerys muttered with a mocking smile. Many might say he was good and benevolent, but for Daenerys, Baelor was summed up in a single word: weak. Descending from Balerion, Daenerys, wearing a blood-red dress with the coat of arms of House Targaryen, touched the white marble floor. She took the gold crown studded with rubies, attached to her waist by a delicate silver chain, and placed it on her silver hair. As soon as she descended, the Sardaukar appeared before her and, without waiting for orders from the queen, immediately surrounded her, protecting her at all times. Balerion let out a disgruntled roar at those daring ants, and his coal-red eyes sharpened, revealing a sharp, menacing gaze. "Easy, son." Daenerys stroked the scales on the dragon's neck and whispered in a gentle tone. She knew that Balerion was annoyed at being surrounded by so many people. The dragon let out a guttural sound and calmed down with his mother's help, although he continued to watch the people around him with an increasingly cold gaze. Merrick's lips twitched as he felt the dragon's gaze on him. Although it seemed impossible, he felt that Balerion was watching him with a particularly icy gaze. "What have I done to deserve the Dragon Queen's hatred?" Merrick asked himself, feeling helpless. He knew that his future career could be in jeopardy if he didn't win the dragon's sympathy. As a former Immaculate, his only ambition was to grow in the military career created by the king. "Merrick, call the people. Let them see their queen for the first time." Unaware of her loyal Sardaukar's thoughts, Daenerys ordered with a calm, regal tone. Merrick tapped his chest and replied in a respectful voice, "Yes, my queen." The Sardaukar didn't hesitate to obey the queen's orders and ordered his subordinates to create a safe and perfect perimeter for Daenerys. In just over half an hour, the entire square was filled with people. Even though it was impossible to count them, Daenerys assumed that there were around 10,000, and there weren't more because space didn't allow it. She also noticed men dressed in white, with the symbol of the 7 stars embroidered on the chest of their clothes. These men and women carried weapons, which, according to the agreement between the Faith of the Seven and King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, was an act of high treason. Daenerys narrowed her eyes as she observed a middle-aged man wearing a simple gray tunic. From the respect with which he was treated, she realized that he was the High Sparrow, the greatest religious leader in King's Landing at the time. Their gazes met in an exchange of calm, courteous expressions. Daenerys didn't want to frighten her prey before the time was right, and the High Sparrow only greeted the incestuous abomination as a mere formality. Turning her gaze to the crowd, which remained calm under the control of the Sardaukar and the soldiers of House Velaryon, Daenerys stepped forward and spoke with a gentle, elegant yet regal tone, unusual for a girl of almost 14. "I am Daenerys Targaryen, queen and wife of my husband, Enar I of House Targaryen." Her sweet, gentle voice spread through the crowd, and those closest to her helped relay her words to those in the background. If there was one thing good looks were useful for, it was making a strong impression on people. And, without a doubt, the Targaryens were masters at drawing attention to themselves with their extraordinary beauty. Everyone was mesmerized by Daenerys' beauty. With her majestic dress and the crown on her silver hair, the young woman, who didn't look very old, seemed like a goddess descended on the world to save them from misery, hunger, and death. Looking into the eyes of those commoners, Daenerys crushed any remnants of compassion in her chest and began to direct the crowd's hatred. "Robert Baratheon abandoned you for fear of the dragons. He purposely took all the food, the guards, and abandoned King's Landing to take refuge on Casterly Rock." As soon as his words echoed, cries of anger, hatred, and resentment spread through the place. "Unworthy king! The worst king Westeros has ever seen! Fat king!" Daenerys was pleased to hear the rancorous cries. "Robert is just a usurper who killed his own cousin and stole the throne. He was never worthy to sit on the Iron Throne." She threw even more fuel on the hatred at that moment, reminding everyone that Robert was a murderer of relatives. "He'll burn in hell. Killer of kin. May the gods punish him for doing something so cruel." Chapter 144, Home Sweet Home v. Seeing the fury of the people, Daenerys smiled. As long as the people hated Robert, she felt that controlling the city would be much simpler. Now she just needed to show that she cared and would take care of everything regarding King's Landing. King's Landing will be House Targaryen's fiefdom again. The Sardaukar and the troops of House Velaryon will be responsible for the security of the city. At the same time, I will ask Lord Mace Tyrell to send food to the city. Daenerys spoke with a gentle, elegant tone. She looked at the people and flashed a beautiful smile. She knew very well that her own appearance was a great weapon for confusing people's minds. Listening to Daenerys' words, people didn't care about King's Landing returning to the hands of House Targaryen. They only cared about the safety and food that Daenerys promised. If it had been before, maybe those two things wouldn't have seemed like such a big deal, but after experiencing the previous chaos, people realized how good it was to be guaranteed safety and basic food. So when Daenerys declared that she would protect them and bring them food, their affection for this beautiful young queen rose dramatically to extremely high levels. If Daenerys continued to be a good monarch, the people might even grant her an epithet like the kind or the merciful. "Long live Queen Daenerys," a woman from Chataya's brothel shouted in the crowd. As soon as she spoke, the rest of the people followed her and started cheering Daenerys' name. "Long live the Queen! Long live the Queen! The savior of King's Landing!" Daenerys looked at the woman in the crowd and winked at her, thanking her subordinate for taking the first step. Myrla felt a sense of accomplishment at seeing Daenerys wink at her. As a girl taken in by the Red Temple from a young age, she had always dedicated her life to the Red faith. Seeing that her devotion was bearing fruit couldn't have been more gratifying. Daenerys spoke a few more words to the people and then climbed back onto Balerion. The dragon took flight, causing countless people to exclaim in shock at seeing it up close like that. Merrick knew exactly where the queen was going and quickly mobilized the Sardaukar to head towards the Red Keep, while Montfort and Arrayne used their own soldiers to prevent any riots from breaking out. As Merrick had predicted, Daenerys did indeed fly towards the Red Keep. It was the place she most wanted to be at that moment. However, knowing that she needed to be cautious, she only entered the castle when the Sardaukar arrived. She walked down the main corridor and stopped in front of two doors, which she moved personally, revealing the interior of the place. A throne room. Daenerys' eyes ignored anything else and focused entirely on the twisted steel monstrosity. Iron swords protruded around the steps like a mountain of steel. The steps of the throne were blackened and twisted metal, and above them, a black metal seat rose up. Even without sitting down yet, Daenerys knew that the thing was extremely uncomfortable and that the danger of cutting herself was even greater. She really wanted to understand what was going through Aegon the Conqueror's head when he created such an uncomfortable and dangerous throne. If that man wanted his descendants to understand the responsibility of kingship, he should have made a heavy crown. Enar will definitely change that throne. Daenerys muttered as she walked across the comfortable carpet, heading towards the throne at the end of the hall. Climbing the steps, she was careful not to injure herself on one of the sharp edges, but soon regretted wearing a dress. With each step, the fabric caught on the sharp blades. Finally, after much care, Daenerys sat on the Iron Throne, looking straight out across the hall. The queen looks like the reincarnation of Rhaenys. Hearing the gentle, effeminate voice, Daenerys' lilac eyes fell on a fat, white, bald man wearing a yellow tunic. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere from behind a pillar. Merrick's face darkened. He didn't even have to give orders. The Sardaukar immediately surrounded the man from all directions. 5 spearheads came dangerously close to the stranger's neck. Daenerys crossed her legs, placing one over the other, and looked at him with a touch of interest before asking, curious, "And who might you be?" Varys ignored the spears dangerously close to his neck and answered with a respectful tone. "I am Varys, your grace. Master of Whisperers to your father Aerys. And also Master of Robert's Whisperers," Daenerys added with a cold stare. Varys served 2 people she despised, Aerys and Robert. The reason Daenerys disliked her own father was very simple. Riella had already told her everything Aerys had done to her. How could she feel any affection for such a madman who sadistically raped and tortured his own wife? The ritual of burning a person alive before rape was even more disgusting. If she could, Daenerys would really like to thank Jaime for killing Aerys, otherwise she would have done it herself if he were still alive. Seeing the kindness in the queen's eyes gradually replaced by the purest coldness, Varys didn't panic, nor did his heart beat faster at the deadly situation he found himself in. If there was one thing Varys understood about kings, it was that these men didn't care whether you were a horse or a eunuch. As long as you were useful, kings put aside any feelings of animosity. "I've always done my duty very well, your grace," Varys commented with a gentle, harmless smile. But for those who really knew him, that smile could only cause fear. Really, serving 2 mad kings is worthy of praise. After all, you're a dog who doesn't care about his master. Daenerys commented with a sarcastic tone. As the head of a spy network, how could she not know about the man in front of her? Varys could be many things, but harmless and gentle were not characteristics that could be associated with such a cruel and cunning man. Varys' face remained unchanged and his smile only deepened. As your grace said, I really only serve those who sit on the Iron Throne and nothing else. He spoke with a peaceful, gentle tone. Daenerys narrowed her eyes, watching the eunuch with a thoughtful look. Trust him? The thought hadn't even crossed her mind. She would rather trust an irrational snake than Varys. But as the man himself had said, he was a good dog with many skills. Since you want to be my dog, I'll give you the chance. Daenerys said, looking at Varys with a calm, deep gaze, not at all befitting a 13-year-old girl. In half an hour I want all the nobles and knights errant in the throne room. She continued, with a particularly cold tone. If you fail, you don't have to come back. I don't need useless people. Varys gave her a satisfied look. He wasn't afraid of work, he was just afraid that Daenerys wouldn't give him the chance to prove his talents. I will do as you command, your grace. Bowing, Varys spoke with a calm, confident tone. Watching the eunuch's back as he left the throne room, Daenerys gave him a cold smile. When a dog is beyond saving in the face of illness, it's only natural to sacrifice it to spare it further suffering. She muttered with a sarcastic look on her face. Varys had betrayed his father and now he was betraying Robert. How could Daenerys trust someone like that? But as long as he was still useful, she wouldn't mind having an obedient dog to help her stabilize the city more quickly. My queen, do you wish me to capture you to discover the location of the secret passages? Merrick asked with a particularly murderous tone. Varys' mere presence in the throne room was something he saw as his own failing. What if it was an assassin armed with a crossbow? Would he have had time to protect Daenerys? So Merrick was really thinking about capturing, torturing and extracting information from the eunuch. He knew that Varys had probably entered the throne room through some secret passage. As the Queen's guardian, he had a sacred duty to know all the hidden passages to ensure that something like this never happened again. No need. We'll put that aside for a moment and focus on getting the city under control as quickly as possible. Daenerys shook her head and spoke in a calm tone. She didn't fear an assassination attempt. The Sardaukar would be all around her at all times, inspecting every corner, including her chambers and bathroom, before she used them. Although reluctant, Merrick nodded.
Look, if you've actually made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on then, hit subscribe. And honestly, if you think a friend of yours would like this, go on and share it with them. It really helps out. Right, I'm done. I'll get out of your hair now so you can get back to the good stuff. But seriously, stick around till the end. It's well worth it.
Chapter 145, Home Sweet Home 6. Looking at the nobles without fiefdoms and the wandering knights, Daenerys spoke with a calm tone. Kneel or die. There is no third option. Her lilac eyes regarded those men with indifference. While the people were dying, these people just locked themselves in their mansions and ignored everything that was happening in King's Landing. In her eyes, these people were leeches, parasites of King's Landing, always enjoying the benefits of the city, but giving nothing back in return. In short, a bunch of ungrateful and petty people, greedy for money and political power at court. Hearing Daenerys' words, most of them didn't hesitate to kneel. They had no choice or they would die. Daenerys' eyes focused not on the people who knelt, but on those who remained standing. There were 5 men of different ages. The oldest didn't look a day over 30. The others were younger, though equally resolute in their actions. Carl looked at the Mad King's daughter and smiled mockingly. Your father killed mine, burning him alive just to satisfy his sick pleasure. I'd rather die than kneel to the daughter of my father's murderer. The other men had similar backgrounds. Each of them had lost relatives burned alive by order of the Mad King. How could they kneel before Daenerys? Daenerys narrowed her eyes, but did not immediately order the execution of these men. I don't like my father any more than you 5 do. What he did is unforgivable and never will be, but I'm not my father and I definitely don't like burning people. I don't like burning potential allies, to be exact. Daenerys added this phrase in her mind, but obviously didn't say it out loud. Perhaps, being a Targaryen, seeing people die under the flames of dragons was especially beautiful and satisfying. Will you put the sins of the father on the children? Daenerys asked in a calm, cold tone, looking at those men who had lost loved ones on her father's orders. Carl opened his mouth, but no words came from his lips. In the end, he shook his head and spoke with a calm but resentful tone. It doesn't matter. You are the daughter of the Mad King, perhaps you inherited his madness. As the daughter of my father's murderer, no matter what you say, you are just as guilty for having such a mad and sinful bloodline. Daenerys' eyes were completely devoid of emotion as she heard the slanderous words of the man before her. She felt an unconscionable fury bubbling up in her chest, ready to explode at any moment. If there was one thing she was proud of, it was her lineage, her noble Valyrian lineage, which had created one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Although she didn't agree with slavery, she still admired the civilization from which House Targaryen originated. Honestly, Daenerys wanted to order them to build a funeral pyre and burn those people alive so that they would learn never to dare say such words again. But she couldn't. If she did, she would be showing everyone that she was just as mad as her father. She could imagine the goodwill she had just won from the people of King's Landing disappearing overnight. Taking a deep breath to calm her murderous tendencies, Daenerys spoke with a tone devoid of warmth. Merrick, capture these men and then hang them in front of the people. Let them tell what happens to those who dare slander House Targaryen. As he said this, his eyes focused on the wandering nobles and knights, causing those men to shudder. They couldn't imagine that such a young girl was capable of deciding someone's death with such ease. How could they know that Daenerys grew up with a constant sense of danger, living a childhood locked in rooms, not daring to go out because of assassination attempts? Even so, the girl experienced one assassination attempt after another. This made Daenerys unlike any other girl her age. If there was anyone more determined among Rhaella, Visenya, and Daenerys, it was Daenerys herself. She had learned that hesitation leads to death, and if you die, you lose everything. Letting out a sigh, Carl looked at Daenerys with a calm gaze as the guards in golden masks grabbed him and his companions, dragging them out of the throne room. None of them begged for their lives. There was only resentment in their gazes, as if they hated the fate they were about to face. Turning her gaze to those present, Daenerys spoke with a cold tone. I don't care how, but you're going to distribute food until the supplies from the Reach arrive. If I hear you've raised prices, you'll become dragon food. She needed to warn those greedy people, or the price of food would skyrocket to absurd levels, making it impossible for commoners to buy food. If that happened, the blame would fall not on those merchants, but on herself. And once that happened, riots would break out and her image and that of House Targaryen would be further tarnished. This was completely unacceptable, so Daenerys felt she had to warn and threaten those people severely. Fortunately, the greediest merchants had already been killed by hungry people and thieves the previous nights, which saved her a lot of trouble. You may leave and remember my words, Valyrian has been especially hungry recently. Daenerys spoke with a menacing tone, without hiding the threat in her words. Those nobles, who weren't even considered minor houses, nodded quickly, without any hesitation. They were greedy for gold and political power, but they valued their lives above all else. When everyone left, Daenerys' eyes focused on Montfort and Arrayne. Lord Valerian and Lord Waters, I have a mission for you too. Both men straightened up and looked at Daenerys, sitting on the Iron Throne, with respect and fear. They had heard what the Queen had said to these men earlier and knew that the young woman was especially decisive when it came to killing. We will probably be attacked by the militant faith and the fanatics of the Sparrows. I want you to wait for the right moment to surround and kill these people. A cold smile outlined Daenerys' beautiful lips. Montfort swallowed hard at the Queen's words. They weren't just attacking some noble house or organization, but the largest religion in Westeros. For more than 6,000 years, the faith of the Seven had remained strong and intact while entire kingdoms disappeared into the river of time. The only time it suffered significant losses was with the arrival of House Targaryen in Westeros. Before that, no matter how arrogant a king was or how large his army, no one had ever dared to even think about taking on the faith of the Seven. Now, knowing that they would attack the faith inside King's Landing sent a shiver through Montfort's body. He could imagine the chaos that would spread across the continent. The people would be furious, and the faith of the Seven would gather a veritable army of believers to march on the capital. Just as Montfort was about to try to persuade Daenerys, Arrayne beside him knelt down and spoke with a firm, confident tone. Don't worry, my queen. I will kill your enemies and make sure they die in the most painful way possible. Daenerys looked at Arrayne with satisfaction. Having a loyal dog who would do her dirty work without hesitation was truly gratifying. She knew the consequences of her actions, but she also had Enar's permission to continue the purge. Aware that she had to reward and punish appropriately, Daenerys spoke in a gentler, more encouraging tone. If you complete the mission well, I will legitimize you and give you a fiefdom. Owain felt his body tremble at the queen's words. Fiefdom. 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 He screamed uncontrollably in his mind. How could his brother understand his obsession? Only by being a noble would he have the opportunity to ascend. His brother would never know what it was like to be at the bottom of the food chain. He had already been born a noble and heir to a powerful house. Yes, your majesty. Owain replied with a tone full of motivation. The consequences of facing the faith of the Seven? He didn't care. In fact, he wished those fanatics were even stronger, so that he could win more fiefdoms and receive an even greater fiefdom. Owain didn't fear the fight, he feared not being able to fulfill his ambitions. Montfort looked at his half-brother as if he were mad. However, feeling Daenerys' steely eyes on him, the leader of House Velaryon didn't dare express what he was thinking at that very moment. Chapter 146, Home Sweet Home 7. With Daenerys' orders, the execution of the 5 men began without any delay. The executioner didn't use his sword to kill them, but pulled a simple lever, causing the wooden floor to collapse. At the same moment, the 5 men instinctively struggled. After all, the human brain was programmed to stay alive even in the worst possible conditions. Even though these men had accepted death, their bodies didn't, and they tried desperately to breathe. In the end, the 5 of them agonized for a few minutes before finally suffocating to death in front of the watching crowd. Owain nodded with satisfaction as he watched them die. He only wished that King's Landing was in even more chaos so that he could earn more merit. However, with the presence of Daenerys and the High Sparrow in the city, the riots gradually calmed down. The thieves, murderers and rapists were killed outright, and their heads were still on carts, creating a truly shocking and terrifying scene. However, Owain noticed that, as the days passed, there was no movement on the part of the clergy, almost as if they had accepted that King's Landing had changed owners. But Owain knew, how could the most arrogant group of people on the continent lower their heads? The calmer things got, the bigger the wave that would come his way. It was like the sea, only when it was calm were the waves still forming. Rugurgurg. A loud, powerful roar echoed above the city. Owain, who was patrolling King's Landing, looked up and, instead of Queen Daenerys' black dragon, a bronze dragon could be seen flying overhead. Another Targaryen with a dragon. Owain muttered with a smile. With reinforcements arriving, he had no doubt that they would win the coming war. Daenerys, in the king's bedroom, looked at the bronze-colored dragon over the city with a happy look. Her mother had arrived, just as Enar had said. Without any hesitation, Daenerys put on comfortable clothes and headed towards the courtyard of the Red Keep. The Sardaukar followed her, protecting her at all times. They would give their lives to save her, no one doubted that. Arriving in the courtyard, Daenerys saw her mother climbing down from her dragon, Vermithor, and greeted her happily. "Mother." Looking at her daughter, Riella couldn't help but hug her deeply, holding tightly to the girl who had grown up alongside her. "You silly girl. Do you know how anxious I was after hearing that you dared to come and conquer King's Landing with just a handful of men?" Riella spoke with a worried and annoyed tone at the same time. However, looking at the girl who was turning into a woman with the passage of time, Riella spoke with a tone full of pride. "I'm proud of you." Daenerys laughed and hugged her mother even tighter. Originally, she thought she would be scolded for long hours, but seeing the pride in her eyes made her realize that, although Riella was angry, the pride she felt at that moment was stronger than any resentment. "Welcome to King's Landing after almost 15 years, mother." Daenerys spoke with a tone full of joy. Riella didn't reply immediately. She looked at the Red Keep with a nostalgic gaze. Although she had spent the worst years of her life in that castle, she still loved it. It was where her whole family had been born and raised. All the good times easily outweighed the bad ones she had suffered over the years. "Home, sweet home." Riella murmured with a slightly tearful tone, a feeling she quickly suppressed, returning to a calm expression. "Come on, we'll break our morning fast together." Holding her mother's hand, Daenerys pulled her into the Red Keep, while the Sardaukar followed. In Daenerys' room the food was already served, but neither of them touched the plates on the table. Before eating, they began to talk. "How is the city?" Riella asked with a worried tone. She only knew the basic information Enar had told her. "Still tense, but it's calmed down with the food those nobles are selling. Although the faith of the Seven is still silent." Daenerys replied with a cold tone at the mention of the faith of the Seven. She had heard that patience was a virtue, but she never thought that the High Sparrow would take that phrase to the extreme. The man didn't seem to mind her influence spreading deeper and deeper into the city. "I'll start executing the prisoners to force the faith of the Seven to mobilize." Daenerys gave him a shrewd look and continued, "Since they're patient, I'll force them to attack me." Riella frowned and asked, confused, "They're just thieves and murderers. How could that kind of scum make the church start a war?" Daenerys smiled and replied coolly, "One of the prisoners is a Septan. This Septan used his authority to rape women and men in exchange for protection." Riella instantly understood her daughter's plan. How could the church allow one of its members to be tried in the eyes of the people? Even if there was a trial, it would have to be carried out by the High Septon, not the court of House Targaryen. At the same time, once the church tries to prevent the rapist from being put to death, as well as tarnishing the sacred image of the faith, interrupting an execution ordered by the queen herself will be an act of treason. I could attack him without people accusing me of tyranny. Daenerys smiled even wider, imagining the High Sparrow's expression at the conspiracy she had prepared against the church. Riella looked at her daughter speechlessly, seeing her smile like a true villain. The plan was cruel, strong, and incredibly cunning. She couldn't help thinking that Daenerys was really suited to the palace intrigues of the court. If she had such skills in her youth, all the women at court would obey her without any hesitation. "Stop smiling like that, you look like a villain." Riella squeezed Daenerys' cheeks and commented with a helpless tone, "You've been greatly influenced by Enar." Daenerys felt her cheeks burn with shame at her mother's words. "How are things at court?" Riella released her daughter's cheeks and asked, "Are you managing everything successfully?" Daenerys felt a headache coming on as she listened to her mother's words. Remembering how many things she had to do to manage a city of 500,000 people, she wished that Enar would win the war as soon as possible so that she wouldn't have to deal with so much bureaucracy. Yes, power was a good thing, but she found that she was working so hard that she was starting to get stressed. Fortunately, although Montford Valerion wasn't a great warrior, he was an excellent liege lord. After all, he controlled a powerful fleet of ships. With his help, Daenerys was able to work much more calmly, which made her realize why the kings had created the small council. It wasn't just to distribute the interests of the court, but also because the workload was too exhausting. Daenerys felt that if she wasn't careful, she could spend entire days just reviewing documents about King's Landing. And this considering that the city's port was still closed, making it impossible for foreign ships to arrive. "I want Enar to come back soon. That's his job and I don't want him to." Daenerys let out a helpless sigh and replied with a tone full of anticipation for her husband's arrival. As soon as Enar returned, she would be free of that hell of paperwork and endless decisions. Riella couldn't help but laugh when she heard her daughter's words. Many would kill to be at the center of power in Westeros, but Daenerys really just wanted to be free of responsibility. How could that not be funny? "Before I left, Enar said he would send Willis Tyrell, his master of coin. He'll help stabilize King's Landing's finances." Riella comforted her daughter with a gentle, warm tone. On hearing this, Daenerys' face turned grim. That bastard Robert took all the money with him. He didn't even leave a golden dragon. She gritted her teeth. King's Landing is practically bankrupt, without any money to repair weapons, armor, buy food, or anything else that involves money. If Robert were standing in front of her now, Daenerys felt like she could devour his flesh and drink his blood. 90% of her problems came from a lack of money. If it hadn't been for that, she could have calmed the situation much faster. Riella wasn't surprised. After all, they were enemies. How could Robert leave money to be used by the enemy? "Let's eat," Riella said, changing the subject to ease the tension in the air. Daenerys nodded and began to eat, talking to her mother with a big smile on her face. Chapter 147, Home Sweet Home, 8. In the square in front of the Great September of Baelor, Daenerys was sitting on a chair next to her mother, watching the people huddle below. A smile appeared on her lips. The execution of the Septan was about to begin, as was the spectacle she had prepared especially for the faith of the Seven. "What do you think will happen, mother?" Daenerys asked with a smile, looking at the crowd gathered below the execution platform. "Obviously, the man called the High Sparrow will intervene in the execution," Riella replied in a calm tone. She glanced at the two dragons standing not far away. They were there in case things got out of hand at the intense moment of the spectacle that was about to begin. At the same time, around 3,000 soldiers surrounded the square, all ready to retaliate at any sign of mutiny on the part of the Faith of the Seven. Daenerys nodded and didn't hide the smile on her lips. She was really looking forward to cleansing King's Landing of those damned arrogant, cruel, and murderous Septans. Every brother, sister, cousin, or any other relative had to be avenged. No matter what, she would make the Faith of the Seven regret ever having existed. But if there was anyone in the world who hated the Faith of the Seven even more, it was Riella. Only a parent knows the pain of losing a son or daughter. All the sons and daughters who had died before her, all the miscarriages she had suffered. She remembered each one. The memories were so vivid that she could never forget her dead sons and daughters. Riella considered herself a cold and controlled woman, because if she had the explosive temperament typical of the Targaryens, she would have ridden into Vermithor and flown to Old Town to set fire to the whole town, reducing it to ashes until no one was left to tell the tale. All to avenge his sons and daughters. So if there was anyone who wanted the Faith of the Seven to dare move, it was Riella herself. The pain, hatred, and resentment bubbled up in her chest, threatening to explode at any moment. And when they did, everyone would see what a truly furious woman was. While Daenerys and Riella talked, Owain brought the chained Septan to the execution platform. To make things even more dramatic, Daenerys had ordered the Septan to wear extremely expensive and luxurious clerical robes, highlighting the extraordinary status of the man who was about to be beheaded. And honestly, the crowd's reaction to seeing the Septan beautifully dressed was shocking, to say the least. In the eyes of the people, the Septans were servants of the gods. How could such noble people commit crimes? As he placed the Septan on his knees on the ground, Owain smiled and drew his sword. He looked at the crowd and declared loudly, "This is Marsty Norse, Septan of the Great September of Baelor. He was caught red-handed for murdering and raping men and women. I am Septan of the Great September of Baelor. I will not be judged by human laws." Marsty shouted loudly. The man, who was about 50 years old, had never been so humiliated in his entire life. Not even the nobles dared to be so arrogant in front of him. "I will not be judged in the court of incestuous abominations and their demonic servants from hell on another continent." Looking at Daenerys and Riella, Marsty shouted even more angrily at the situation he found himself in. Daenerys looked at the Septan with a bored expression. "You should read more. Repeating the same offenses makes the insults rather boring," she said in a calm tone, her eyes staring at the kneeling man with a sarcastic look. Marsty's face took on an expression of pure anger, so much so that his skin reddened slightly, showing how furious he was. "However, you are wrong about something," Daenerys continued. "The laws of men must be respected by all men. You have abused your position, deceived men and women, committed abominable acts, and you will pay for it like anyone else. Your status as a Septon won't make the slightest difference now. You will die like the nobles who were hanged. The laws must be followed so that others like you fear to think of committing any crime." Daenerys finished with a cold, calm tone. The people heard her words and cast different glances at the young queen. If before everyone had admired her strength, at that moment they began to admire Daenerys herself. Crime? Marsty seemed to hear the funniest thing in the world. "No one has ever judged a Septon. You won't be the first, you incestuous little whore." Merrick, who until then had remained motionless, glared at the man who had dared to insult his queen. Without hesitation, he approached with a whip and struck it against the Septon's back. The whip, made of leather and treated with salt, was not only powerful but also inflicted extreme pain. "Arg!" A painful groan escaped Marsty's lips. The luxurious robes tore at her back, and the whip struck her skin squarely, leaving deep red marks, with blood oozing from the wound. "Pig, be careful with your words. My queen must not be dishonored by a worm like you," Merrick said, looking at the man who was screaming in pain. "I'll kill you." Marsty growled through clenched teeth. He could feel the extremely strong burning in his back. He had never been humiliated so much in his life. Merrick sneered. Did the man really think he would still be alive after that day? "Begin the execution," Daenerys ordered, turning her gaze to the Great September of Baelor with an excited expression. She had made sure that the execution took place in front of the Great September to encourage the faith militant to act quickly. However, even at that moment, the temple gates remained firmly closed. There wasn't even a guard watching the place. "I refuse to believe that these people will stand idly by before the execution of one of their important members," Daenerys muttered, looking at the great September of Baelor with a calm gaze. Begin the execution. She didn't hesitate to decree the start of the sentence. Rising from her chair, Daenerys spoke aloud. I, Daenerys of House Targaryen, in the name of King Enar of House Targaryen, first of the name, King of the Undulls, the Roiners and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. She paused briefly before continuing. I sentence you to death for the crimes of murder and rape. Then, looking at the man, she asked with a sarcastic tone, Last words? Marsty spat on the ground and spoke with contempt. I doubt you'll dare kill me. Your damned government will collapse like all the kingdoms that dared to fight against the faith of the Seven. Aurane. With no patience to continue listening, Daenerys sat down again. Aurane didn't need to be a genius to understand the order. Without any hesitation, she forced the Septan to place his head on a log and held his sword firmly. Marsty scoffed and didn't resist. He simply couldn't believe that Daenerys would have the courage to kill him. After all, he was the Septan of the Great September of Baelor, the second most influential man in the Faith of the Seven, second only to the High Septan in Old Town. With that status, he was sure that girl wouldn't be bold enough. Suddenly, however, Marsty felt an intense but brief pain. Just then the world seemed to spin. Confused, he looked down and saw a headless body that looked familiar. As darkness engulfed his consciousness, he was still trying to understand why that body seemed so familiar. But then everything faded away. Even in his last moments, he never imagined that Daenerys would be insane enough to declare war on the faith of the Seven with such an act of blasphemy. Aurane lifted the Septan's decapitated head, a discreet smile on his lips, and handed it to Daenerys. She, however, only replied in a casual tone. Give it to the pigs or anything that eats garbage. Yes, my queen. Aurane replied respectfully, raising her head so that the crowd could see her. The spectators were still stunned by the Septan's clean and swift execution. This is the final fate of sinners, Aurane murmured in a gentle tone, although his eyes revealed a cunning glint. With still no sign of any reaction from the faith of the Seven, Daenerys' face became increasingly grim. She really hadn't expected those people to be so patient in the face of an event that could tarnish the church's reputation. But seeing that there was no movement inside the Great September of Baelor, Daenerys' mood turned cold and murderous. Since you don't care, I'm going to take your lands, cancel the tax exemption and increase the tributes to the church even more. She muttered, gradually creating a second plan to force the faith of the Seven to rebel publicly. Chapter 148, Battle of the Crossing I. Climbing a relatively high hill, Enar looked at the huge twin castles on either side of the green fork of the Trident. The castle was one of the most formidable fortresses on the continent of Westeros. Honestly, without dragons and cannons, it would be extremely difficult to conquer twins. Eddard said as he saw the twin castles, one on either side of the river. A tower in the middle of the bridge connected the castles. The walls were thick and fortified, looking powerful and impenetrable. Enar nodded. The castle before him was truly powerful, almost a second Harrenhal in terms of defense. How do you want to attack? Eddard asked in a calm tone. Use the cannons first, I want to test the attack power against such a powerful castle. Enar said, looking at the castle with a smile on his face. Eddard was also curious about the cannons. He had seen the power of the guns and wanted to know if they were effective against castles. If they were, he planned to arm Winterfell's walls with cannons, making the already powerful castle even more formidable. With Enar's orders, the army set to work in full force. As well as building the camp, the soldiers began to position the cannons. Oberyn and Tyrion were even more excited. Being close to Enar allowed them to see something they had never imagined. Civilization, which had previously seemed stagnant for 7 millennia, was slowly advancing with Enar at the helm. What do you think Walder Frey's expression will be when he hears the cannon fire? Tyrion asked with a curious tone as he sipped some wine. He's so old he might be scared to death. Oberyn commented with an amused smile on his lips. Walder Frey was almost 90, almost an old relic who refused to die of natural causes. I heard that the old man had recently married a young woman. Tyrion commented, amazed at Walder's efficiency in having children. The man had so many children and grandchildren that he was like a small army. I want to know that secret too. Oberyn said with a lascivious grin on his face, imagining himself at 90 and still being able to fuck men and women. Oberyn and Tyrion looked at each other and laughed. Looking at their smiles, they're talking about women. Arianne commented with an amused smile at the sight of the two enemies turned friends. Well, that's our father, Obara said, looking at the dwarf and his father chatting happily, even though they were at war. Nymeria shook her head as she deftly moved a dagger between her fingers. The most important thing is to focus on the war. Our father has already legitimized us with the victory at Hay Castle. Now we have to earn merit to receive fiefs from King Enar. Hearing Nymeria's words, Obara and Tyene didn't know what to feel. They had never imagined that they would have legitimate status after so long living as bastards in the eyes of all Westeros. Have you chosen the name of the noble house yet? Arianne asked curiously. She was happy for her friends. Only nobles could have armies, and armies meant power to protect themselves in the future. The three girls looked at each other and shook their heads, expressing that they hadn't thought of anything like that so far. I'll help, Arianne said with a smile, looking at the three women with a helpless look. Others would be thanking the gods if they were legitimized, but the three women seemed in no hurry to create a noble house. While the women were talking, Titus and Sigismund appeared next to Enar. Both were tall and powerful, veritable mobile fortresses. No one doubted the power of these men. Messiah. They both greeted Enar. Looking at his first primarchs, Enar nodded with satisfaction. Has the mission been completed? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. The two primarchs wouldn't return if they hadn't completed the mission. Yes, all the blood has been saved and is waiting to be used by the Son of Light. Sigismund, who was bald and had a robust, angular face, replied with a serious tone, incredibly calm and firm. Enar flashed a smile and said, "Thank you for your hard work. For the blood spilled and saved, it's enough to turn 300 people into super soldiers." Enar muttered to himself. It wasn't a large number, but if you compared the combat effectiveness of these 300 men, they were equivalent to 2,000 or 3,000 ordinary soldiers. A smile appeared on Enar's lips. He realized that he was rushing too fast. It was only the beginning of the war, and he wouldn't be short of blood to complete the blood ritual on his soldiers. However, he knew that the Empire could never stop expanding. The blood of sentient life was necessary for the blood ritual, and he couldn't simply sacrifice the human race. So, in the future, foreign races would be the focus of expansion. Honestly, if the enemy didn't have armies in infinite hordes, Enar wouldn't want to embark on limitless expansionism against the other races of the known universe. But without the blood needed for the ritual of the Astartes warriors, the empire of humanity would be defeated in the face of the warp's endless hordes of demons. Titus and Sigismund. Enar looked at the primarchs and spoke with a cold tone. When the attack begins, I want you two on the front line. Yes, my emperor. Titus and Sigismund beat their chests and spoke aloud. There was no hesitation or any other unnecessary sentiment, just the mission and nothing more. Leda looked at them both with envy. Although she considered her duty to protect the king sacred, she also wanted to go to war. However, she knew that her duty was more important than anything else. Still, he couldn't help the feeling. On the other side, inside the twins, all the sons, daughters and grandchildren of the Lord of the Crossing were gathered in the Great Hall. Note, Walder Frey has around 35 sons and daughters, not counting his grandchildren, and that's not including the unknown bastards. Sitting behind a table, calmly eating and drinking, Walder Frey, the Lord of the Twins, kept a cold, calculating gaze. Father, King Targaryen's army seems to be camping on the hill in front of the castle. They don't seem to have any intention of entering the castle, and… Hostine Frey hesitated to continue. Speak up, you incompetent fool. Walder asked impatiently. There are no coats of arms of houses Charlton, Arenford and Hay. There's no sign of Stevrin, Emmon or Enys either. When Hostine had finished speaking, a heavy silence spread through the hall. All eyes were fixed on Walder Frey. Chewing the meat in his mouth, Walder narrowed his eyes. There was an almost uncontrollable fury reflected in them. He already knew that Enar had not come to accept his surrender. As for the fate of Stevrin, Emmon and Enys, it was obvious. Their children were dead. Send a messenger. Tell him I allow his army to cross the twins into the Riverlands. Walder said with a cold and extraordinarily calm tone. The probable death of his eldest sons caused no great stir in his emotions. He was almost 90 and few things could make him lose his temper. The death of his children was not one of them. At the same time, Walder had completely given up on the plan to poison Enar and his family. All he wanted now was for the enemy army to leave his domain. He didn't dare even think about fighting. If Houses Charlton, Arrynford and Hay were not with King Targaryen's army, then they had been defeated and destroyed. Walder didn't have an army and could only rely on the castle to defend himself. But the other side had dragons, and he didn't want to become the second Harrenhal. He had worked too hard to raise House Frey to its current status to simply commit suicide by facing dragons. "Yes, father." Hosteen replied loudly and hurried out of the great hall. However, 30 minutes later, Hosteen returned holding a letter and handed it to Walder Frey. Opening the seal with a knife, Walder read the contents of the message. He couldn't help but notice that the letters were written in blood. "There is no surrender for traitors. Death awaits you and all your lineage." Signed, King Enar of House Targaryen, first of his name, King of the Undulls, the Royners and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. Walder read aloud, his tone cold and chilling. "Prepare for war," he ordered, rising from his chair with a look of fury that was simply frightening. "I will resist until the Crown Army arrives to confront House Targaryen," he muttered, his gaze as cold as the death that lurked within him. Chapter 149, Battle of the Crossing 2. "Fire!" a soldier shouted while covering his ears. The next second, explosions rang out, making the ground around the cannons seem to shake. GOODMM. Round iron projectiles were fired, accompanied by loud, powerful and frightening sounds. The cannonballs tore violently through the air, hitting the castle walls with ferocity. Chunks of stone flew off, revealing craters where the shots had hit. "The power is very good," Tyrion commented, watching the consecutive attacks on the walls from afar. He couldn't help but admire the blacksmiths who had invented such weapons. He could see that this was only the beginning. In the future, even more powerful weapons could be created, and this brought him a feeling of unreality. Was this really a power that humans should control? But then he laughed at his own naive thoughts. As Enar had said, humans should have the power to choose to self-destruct, instead of leaving that fate in the hands of other beings. Tyrion agreed with the king's words. Humanity could be extinguished by humans themselves, but never by other beings. Perhaps that was human arrogance talking, but he believed it deeply. Imagine these weapons on warships. Besieging a coastal city like Lannisport will be as easy as deflowering a young woman in love. Oberyn commented next to Tyrion with a cold smile. Although the city had a ring of high and powerful walls, with these weapons he could cut a hole in the fortification and begin the invasion without any difficulty. Although the cannons are powerful, their accuracy is less than that of an arrow fired by an archer. With the waves, accuracy will drop even further, making it very difficult to hit a stationary target, such as a wall. Tyrion shook his head, not as optimistic as Oberyn about besieging Lannisport. He had been to the city many times, spent years there and knew only too well how powerful the walls protecting the port were. However, Oberyn's words made sense. If the cannons were placed on ships, there would be no fleets capable of withstanding the fire. In sea battles, cannons on ships would be a real weapon of war. "Do you think the king will sell the cannons?" Oberyn asked in an undertone. He really wanted such weapons protecting Sunspear. "Would you give that power to your vassals?" Tyrion didn't answer directly and instead smiled as he asked his friend. "Never." Oberyn didn't hesitate to answer. It was impossible for him to give cannons to the vassals of House Martell, especially as some noble houses were quite ambitious. Although he knew it was impossible to get the cannons, it didn't hurt to ask. Although the power of the cannons isn't enough to penetrate the walls, the people inside the castle must be terrified. Oberyn changed the subject, flashing a cold smile as he watched the two majestic castles. In the first round of attacks, a cannonball directly hit a man on the ramparts. Oberyn personally saw the man simply explode into a mixture of blood, organs and bones. The image was extremely tragic. Tyrion laughed when he heard Oberyn's words. As his friend had said, he could imagine the dread that the people of House Frey were facing at that moment. It was as if the punishment of the gods was coming in the form of iron, blood, and deafening explosions. If Enar heard Tyrion's thoughts, he would agree with them. Psychological dread was often the main reason for castles surrendering in the Middle Ages. Being under siege for a day was stressful, but imagine weeks, months, or even years. Even those with a strong resolve would be exhausted, and morale would drop to extremely low levels. Enar wanted exactly that effect at that moment. He wanted Walder Frey to feel real terror, as if he could die at any moment. "Husband, are we going to attack with the army or just keep using the cannons?" "Not far from the guns," Visenya asked, glancing at the castle before turning her attention to Enar. She was wearing armor like any man and, unlike what Hollywood and games used to present, there were no breast bulges in the cold metal. Women didn't take part in wars. What woman would be stupid enough to model breasts on armor? Enar looked at Visenya and realized that she was looking forward to the war. It left him speechless. His wife was more excited for battle than many warriors from the north. "No hurry. Walder Frey has probably already sent a raven to Casterly Rock. Let the old lion leave the fortress, come to the Riverlands and conquer some castles." "That's not bad." Visenya looked at Enar in surprise. "Imagine your castle was conquered and someone saved it. Would you feel grateful?" Enar smiled and asked with a playful tone. Visenya immediately understood her husband's intentions. He wanted to win the goodwill of the Riverlands for House Targaryen when he began his campaign. By allowing Tywin Lannister to take a few strongholds before intervening, Enar would ensure that the local houses saw the Targaryens as liberators, making their conquest easier. "You're very cunning, husband," Visenya commented with a small smile on her lips. For her, Enar really was shrewd. "Well, we have to be cunning. Tywin and Walder Frey are old and experienced foxes." Enar laughed too. "Let's go. I have to announce something," Enar said, walking towards the main tent. Visenya followed him with a curious expression. Leda, Titus, Sigismund and Barristan protected the king and queen at all times. Not long afterwards, when everyone was gathered in the tent, Enar spoke with a smile. "Balon has crowned himself king, as has Robert Arryn. In other words, 4 kings are vying for the Iron Throne at the moment." Enar's words made many people's eyes widen in shock. They had never imagined that there would be people so bold as to do something like this at this time. Although Robert was indeed a usurper, at the end of the day he had Targaryen blood. So the battle for the throne was legitimate, but Robert Arryn and Balon Greyjoy weren't close enough by blood to be considered true heirs to House Targaryen. "Isn't Robert Arryn a boy under 10? Oberyn asked with an uncertain tone. As far as he could remember, the heir to the Eagle's Nest was too young. "He's probably a puppet king, controlled by his mother or anyone who has influence over Lisa Tully." Tyrion spoke in a deep tone. He was also aware of the rumors and knew that Lisa Tully was not completely sane. Many rumors claimed that the East ruler had become extremely paranoid after suffering consecutive miscarriages. Tyrion continued, speaking calmly. "It's no surprise that Balon crowned himself king. He's done it before. Now that Westeros is at civil war, he seized the moment and crowned himself again." Suddenly remembering that the King's Landing Court had been moved to Casterly Rock, Tyrion's eyes lit up. "Is that why my father and Robert moved to Casterly Rock? It's actually better to attack the Iron Islands and fend off the dragons from Casterly Rock. Besides, attacking the Reach by sea is also much quicker and safer than by land." Tyrion spoke, glaring at Enar. Enar laughed and confirmed the hand of the king's words. "Yes, as well as fending off dragons, Tywin wants to attack the Reach, the Iron Islands and the Riverlands more easily, without running the risk of getting caught in the siege of some castle that wants to kneel to me. The lion is very cunning. He knows he has no advantage in terms of prestige, and with the dragons, many lords already want to bend the knee to your grace. If Tywin gets stuck in one of those castles, it will only slow him down and turn the tide of the war in our favor." Oberyn commented with a sarcastic tone. "My father is many things, but he's not an arrogant man. He knows that the survival instinct of all the noble houses is to cling to the strongest, and right now we're the strongest with dragons." Tyrion replied with an equally sarcastic smile. "No matter how many kings there are, they're just a few ambitious people." Enar interrupted them both and spoke in a calm tone. "Besides, I want you to keep an eye on Balon. He could ally himself with Robert Baratheon and attack us." Everyone nodded. Turning to Kinvara, Enar spoke calmly. "After we conquer twins, we'll hold a ceremony to bury the dead and spread our faith." Kinvara's eyes lit up at Enar's words. She had come to Westeros for this purpose, to spread the faith to these people who believe in cruel gods. Eddard raised an eyebrow when he heard this, but like everyone else around him, no one dared question Enar's decisions. Even Rhaenys and Visenya remained silent. Chapter 150, Battle of the Crossing 3. Hosteen felt the castle shake slightly, and the growing irritation in his heart only increased. The first few times he was startled by the sound and the impact, but once he realized that the strange weapons couldn't penetrate the walls, he relaxed. However, this feeling of relief only lasted a day, as the attacks didn't stop, not even at night. The first day awake was easy, the second proved difficult, and by the third he was completely exhausted. His mood worsened dramatically, he became irritable and for some reason started hallucinating due to lack of sleep. It wasn't just him, everyone in the castle was in the same situation. Perhaps the only one who could sleep peacefully was his own father, Walder Frey. Hosteen had to admit, his father really was a man of great courage, calm and wisdom. However, he felt he couldn't take it any longer. He was exhausted and unable to sleep. His attempts to lighten the mood, such as sex, wine and watching dances, became ineffective. He had no energy, so how could he have sex or motivate himself to watch a play? "Dad, we can't go on like this. We'll go mad," said Hosteen to his father, who didn't even bother to stop eating. The old man, who was almost 90, didn't look the least bit worried or exhausted, as if he didn't care what happened outside. "You're as disappointing as Stevrin. Stop acting like a frightened woman and calm down," said Walder in a calm, cool tone. His eyes looked at his son with dissatisfaction at the scene. "Since we haven't been reduced to ashes yet, the Targaryen king wants to conquer the twins with his army. But it's not so easy to break through one of the most fortified castles in Westeros," Walder commented, biting into a chicken leg with a sarcastic smile. As soon as he finished speaking, thunder rang out and the castle shook again. However, Walder showed no concern. On the contrary, he smiled, showing off his almost toothless mouth with a few rotten teeth. "We just need to wait for Tywin to arrive with his army," said Walder, glancing at his son's exhausted appearance. "Yes, father," replied Hosteen, reluctantly but respectfully. Deep down, he wanted to use the 1,200 soldiers inside the castle to face an army of hundreds of thousands of men. Of course, it was a stupid idea, but at the moment, in his exhausted mind, it seemed better than going mad in the face of incessant attacks. "Hosteen, there are probably soldiers who are already thinking of betraying us. Kill some random soldiers to warn them what happens to traitors who betray House Frey." Walder spoke with a cold, chilling tone. Hosteen gave him an equally cold look and nodded. He drew his sword from its sheath and walked towards the castle courtyard. Outside the castle, Enar smiled as he observed the damage to the wall. Craters could be seen everywhere. The power of the first versions of the cannons was satisfactory. These were the Twins, one of the most fortified castles in Westeros, not just any castle, and even so, the damage to the wall was significant. Any other weak castle would have fallen before 3 days of being bombarded by cannons. "Brother, when are we going to enter this castle?" Rhaenys asked with a lazy tone as she leaned on his body. She looked up and saw Enar's handsome face, and couldn't help but show a look of tenderness. Enar didn't reply, but his purple eyes flashed for a moment before returning to normal. A smile appeared on his lips. "Jaime Lannister is already leading the army of houses Baratheon and Lannister towards the Riverlands," he said in a gentle tone as his hand stroked Rhaenys' black and white hair. A complicated expression appeared on Rhaenys' face. She couldn't help remembering the dazzling knight with the golden hair and green eyes. When she was a child, Jaime had let her climb on his shoulders, and she had ordered him to run around the courtyard of the Red Keep. It was one of her happiest memories, but everything changed on that tragic day. House Lannister became a mortal enemy, and her feelings for the knight became complicated. She felt gratitude and remembered his kindness, but she also carried anger, resentment, and hatred towards the knight. "Jaime may have saved you, but it was out of guilt, not duty, Rhaenys." Enar noticed her expression and spoke in a calm tone. "He's not worthy of your kindness, he's just a slave to his own desires. He fucks his sister for love, but Cersei herself manipulates that love. He killed Jon Arryn. He killed Robert's babies and bastard offspring without any hesitation." Rhaenys' expression changed dramatically when she heard Enar's words. The image of the big, handsome Jaime Lannister collapsed with just a few words. Her gaze turned cold. Although there was gratitude for the man who had saved her 14 years ago, the feeling of animosity far outweighed the gratitude she felt. "I will show him no mercy, brother." Rhaenys knew that Enar was saying those things because he didn't want her to hesitate at a critical moment in the future. "Remember, only family is worthy of your feelings. Anyone else is not." Enar bent down and gently kissed her forehead, causing Rhaenys to narrow her eyes with a comfortable look on her face. "Enar, will you take me?" Rhaenys asked with a slightly worried tone, fearing that Enar would refuse to take her as his wife. "I will have many sons and daughters. You will be the mother of 2 of them." Enar replied with a teasing smile. He really enjoyed teasing this older sister. Rhaenys' cheeks turned a subtle shade of red when she heard Enar's words. She couldn't help but look at him fiercely. She was a virgin and not married, but Enar said she would be the mother of 2 children. How could something like that be said so blatantly? "Now I know why Daenerys said you like to tease me," Rhaenys commented with a seemingly fierce tone. She was the older sister, but here she was, being teased all the time by her younger brother. Enar just let out a laugh when he heard her fierce tone. She could sound like many things, but fierce was definitely not one of them. However, Rhaenys remembered something and looked at Enar with a glare. "How many wives will you have?" Enar raised an eyebrow in doubt, but answered honestly. 3. Daenerys, Visenya, and Rhaenys. Rhaenys nodded. She didn't mind sharing it with Daenerys and Visenya. After all, she could see that they really did love Enar with all their hearts. "And how many mistresses?" Rhaenys asked with a slightly hostile tone. She couldn't believe that Enar could be so indifferent to the feelings of several noble ladies. 3. Rolling his eyes, Enar replied. "Arianne, Marjorie, and Myrcella." Rhaenys snorted, but was more satisfied with the small number. "Will you have children with these women?" She frowned and asked something important. As children of Enar, these offspring could be allowed to own dragons. After all, they would increase the strength of House Targaryen, especially with the future apocalypse that Enar said would come. But the Dance of the Dragons taught that only House Targaryen should have dragons and that no others could possess them. "Don't worry, those children will be important, but they won't have the right to own dragons." Enar was certainly aware of Rhaenys' concern, but he wasn't worried himself. As long as he was alive, no one, absolutely no one, could even think about rebellion. "Those children are important, otherwise I wouldn't even bother having those women as lovers." Enar commented with a laugh. These bastard children would be important because, unlike his children with Daenerys, Visenya, and Rhaenys, they wouldn't have the potential or the talent to be considered part of his golden lineage. In blood terms, they would only be demigods, in other words, primarchs. Note, if you find it familiar, that's because I basically used Elden Ring's golden lineage. Enar, Rhaenys, Riella, Daenerys, and Visenya will be gods, and their sons and daughters will also be gods. Just like in Elden Ring and Dark Souls. "I know I trust you, but we can never let what happened to House Targaryen during the Dance of the Dragons happen again." Rhaenys commented with a laugh, but trusted Enar that he wouldn't be Viserys I Targaryen. Chapter 151, Battle of the Crossing 4. "Anyone who dares speak again about opening the gates will end up like this." When Hostine said this, he raised his hand and showed a decapitated head. Hostine hadn't expected that. Just as his father had said, there really were people who already wanted to open the gates to allow the enemy army in. This was completely unacceptable to him and to the whole of House Frey. The soldiers, seeing their dead comrade with only his head left, felt only fear. The stress of consecutive attacks was even worse for them, who were not between the walls of the castle, protected by its thick walls, which at least blocked out some of the thunder of the strange weapons on the other side. If Hostine couldn't sleep even between the thick castle walls, the situation was even worse for these soldiers. Not only did they have to stand exposed on the wall, but they also ran the risk of dying at any moment. They had personally seen a comrade in arms blown into 1,000 pieces when he was hit by a metal ball from the sky. They would never forget the terrifying scene. One moment they were chatting normally and the next, their friend had died right in front of them. Now, at the sight of another dead companion, their stress reached alarming levels. So high that for a moment they wanted to shout at Hostine, the son of their feudal lord. But the last remnant of rationality kept them silent. They just watched, full of rage, as their companion's head was thrown to the ground like something disposable. Hostine and Walder didn't know it, but when it came to psychological warfare, a concept that didn't exist in a medieval world like theirs, Enar was the absolute master. He knew very well that, in the face of pressure, anger could often lead to extremely violent mutiny. Seeing that everyone was silent, Hostine showed a satisfied expression and left without looking back. He didn't care what those soldiers thought, nor did he want to waste energy thinking about it. However, he could never have imagined that, after his actions, the last vestige of loyalty that those soldiers still had for House Frey had completely disappeared. If it had been Walder in Hostein's place, the Lord of House Frey would have killed some random soldier and then promised generous rewards, just as a lord should do at times like this, to reinforce his soldiers' loyalty. But Walder could never have foreseen that Hostine, extremely exhausted and sleepy, was simply too lazy to say anything else to those risking their lives to protect the castle. Had he known, he might have done something himself. But there were no ifs in a world like that. Walder would regret it later, but it would be too late to do anything else. Outside the castle, Enar, who was inside the tent drinking soup, raised his head and smiled coldly. His purple eyes glowed slightly before returning to their normal brightness. Rhaenys and Visenya, he called out, looking at both women who waited for his next words. Take your dragons and land on the ramparts. Warn all the soldiers that if they surrender and open the castle gates to my army, they will be pardoned of all crimes. Enar spoke with a slight smile, causing everyone in the main tent to look at him in surprise. Will they accept your grace? Tyrion expressed his doubts. These were no ordinary soldiers, but warriors trained by House Frey. How could they protect the castle if they weren't loyal? No one was stupid enough to leave the defense of the castle in the hands of soldiers they didn't trust. This would prevent exactly what Enar was trying to do at that moment. Yes, they'll take it. Enar drank some water and continued. The soldiers are exhausted after so many days without sleep. With the bad treatment they're getting, no matter how loyal they are, that loyalty has a limit. Is Walder Frey stupid enough not to guarantee the loyalty of his own soldiers in a siege? Oberyn commented in disbelief. Any minimally intelligent lord knew that, during a siege, it was essential to reinforce the loyalty of the soldiers. This was knowledge acquired over millennia of the fall of entire castles and kingdoms. After all, a castle's greatest defense was its wall. A fortress with a wall and moat could basically stop an army of tens of thousands from advancing. But once the wall was compromised, the castle was nothing more than a slightly larger house. It's not just the soldiers who are stressed by the war, but also the members of House Frey themselves are exhausted. Perhaps Walder himself has forgotten that not everyone possesses unshakable determination, especially in the face of death. Enar responded to Oberyn's comment with a satisfied smile. The cannons were proving more effective than he had expected. Originally, he had calculated that the soldiers would hold out for at least a week before giving in. But he had overestimated their determination and that of the members of House Frey. Rhaenys and Visenya didn't give the matter much thought. They got up and left the tent with excited expressions. They were finally going to do something in this war, something they had wanted to do for a long time. They both approached the dragons, who were resting side by side. Rhaenys looked at Moonfire and Visenya at Syrax. Without hesitation, both women mounted their respective dragons. Letting out low, graceful roars, both female dragons rose from the ground. Caraxes, whose eyes had been closed until that moment, briefly opened his eyes to observe the scene before him, but then closed them again indifferently. Rhaenys and Visenya ordered them to fly, and both dragons obeyed. They took a few steps forward before taking flight, soaring into the sky with loud wing beats. The soldiers protecting the wall soon noticed the dragons approaching and turned pale with fear and horror. "Dragons are coming!" one of the soldiers shouted, wasting no time before running for his life. He wasn't the only one. Other soldiers didn't even try to shoot arrows at the dragons. They simply dropped their weapons and ran with all their might. The arrival of the winged beasts was the trigger for the exhausted soldiers' horror. No one wanted to die. Nobody wanted to serve such cruel masters who didn't care about their lives. Nobody wanted to die for Walder Frey. When Hostine and Walder's other sons arrived, the courtyard was already in complete chaos. Some soldiers had given up fighting and were cowering in the corners, mumbling disconnected babbles. "Stop talking and get ready to fight, or I'll kill you all," Hostine shouted, drawing his sword. But his words had the opposite effect to what he expected. The soldiers' anger was not directed at House Targaryen, but at House Frey, at those closest to them. "If we hand them over, we might survive." One of the soldiers spoke in a calm tone. As soon as these words were spoken, all eyes turned to Hostine and Walder's other sons, who were surrounded by the most loyal soldiers. Feeling the gazes upon him, Hostine's face showed no fear. Instead, he shouted even more furiously, "You damn arrogant peasants! I am Hostine Frey, son of Walder Frey, and I order you to pick up your weapons and fight me." The soldiers didn't move immediately, but picked up their weapons as Hostine had ordered. However, instead of climbing the walls, they surrounded Hostine and his entourage. The most loyal soldiers tried to protect him, but in the face of the much larger number of rebels, the resistance didn't last long. Those who remained loyal to House Frey were massacred, and Hostine Frey did not escape the fate of becoming a prisoner. When Moonfire and Syrax landed on the wall, Rhaenys and Visenya were surprised to see the scene in the courtyard. There were corpses scattered around, but what caught their attention most were the 4 men tied up in the center of the courtyard. From the expensive armor and the coats of arms emblazoned on them, both women knew that they were members of House Frey. One of the braver soldiers looked at the 2 dragons on the walls and stepped forward, shouting, "The castle is yours!" Rhaenys and Visenya looked at each other, seeing the surprise reflected in each other's eyes. They had just arrived and thought they would have to make a long speech to convince the soldiers to surrender. However, they had underestimated the terror that a 10-meter-long beast could cause, especially in ordinary people. "Open the gates and let the army of House Targaryen in," Visenya, Enar's wife, ordered in response. "You will be forgiven for all your crimes." Under the surprised eyes of both women, the gates were opened without any hesitation. The situation left Rhaenys and Visenya shocked at the ease, but neither woman complained about such a nice gift. Chapter 152, Battle of the Crossing v. Enar entered twins with a smile. He looked at the soldiers, who seemed impressed by his arrival, and waved to everyone with a charismatic smile, something he knew how to do masterfully. "Don't worry, in the name of the gods I'll keep my word." Noticing the tense expressions of these men, Enar spoke with a calm and regal tone. His words caused the tense faces of the House Frey soldiers to relax, as they all knelt in sincerity. They just wanted this hell to end as soon as possible. They couldn't take it anymore, and they wanted their bed as soon as possible. Enar focused his gaze on the 4 men tied up in the center of the courtyard. He recognized the 4 men, all sons of Walder Frey. The other 3 were irrelevant, only Hostine was a notable figure, at least in terms of fencing. Standing out among almost 40 sons was a good thing. After all, not everyone was a monster like Leda, who had an excellent talent for fencing. "Hostine, I presume." Enar approached the captives and asked with a playful look. Seeing the man's desperate expression satisfied his sadism towards his enemies a little. You could call him a sadist, but breaking an enemy's hope was quite pleasurable. Hostine just spat on the ground and looked at Enar with an arrogant look. Even in such conditions, the man remained arrogant. However, without Enar needing to speak, Leda stepped forward and kicked Hostine in the face with a little force. Although it was a low blow, Leda's low strength and that of ordinary people were completely different. Hostine's entire jaw was dislocated by Leda's kick. Blood, saliva, and teeth fell out nearby. Hostine howled in pain as he could no longer feel his jaw. He tried to speak, but only strange babbles were heard. "Leda, don't attack so hard. He's still our captive and a nobleman." Enar couldn't help but scold Leda, but anyone could see that he was only pretending to scold the 2-meter-10 tall girl. "I beg your pardon, your grace." Without showing that she was really sorry, Leda bowed and spoke in a calm tone, while her gray eyes stared at Hostine with a murderous look. She hated those who showed no respect to Enar, especially a piece of trash like the member of House Frey. "Brother, let's find Walder Frey. I want to see the look on his face when he sees us coming in." Rhaenys looked at Hostine's miserable appearance with a curious eye, but returned her focus to Enar, who let out a laugh and nodded. "Come on, like you, I'm curious to see the man's expression." Enar commented with a smile on his lips. He wanted to see if Walder would beg for mercy or remain arrogant even in the face of death. Visenya looked at them both speechlessly. They looked like villains smiling so sinisterly, they really were brother and sister. Shaking her head, she walked towards him, but not before purposely stepping on Hostine's hand, who glared at her with a bestial look full of rage. Walking through the corridors, the servants who saw his entourage didn't even dare to breathe a little louder, for fear of being killed if they drew attention to themselves. However, there were dozens of truly loyal soldiers in the castle. They were all killed by Leda, who simply drew her sword and eliminated them like a chef chopping vegetables. There was no resistance or anything else, the woman simply lived up to her blood ritual, making it something no normal human could face. Rhaenys and Visenya looked at the scene with glittering eyes. They knew that Enar planned to give these powers to them and to all of House Targaryen. House Targaryen would indeed be worthy of being called the family of the gods. No matter who it was, as long as someone saw Lyta's power, they would do anything to obtain it. After all, that was the temptation of a power capable of turning someone into a god in the eyes of ordinary people. If Rhaenys and Visenya were eager to obtain such power, Barristan was trembling at the overwhelming force he was witnessing. Lyta's power, speed and endurance could no longer be considered human in his eyes. Arthur's niece was a monster. Remembering Titus and Sigismund, Barristan knew that this was one of the king's secrets, perhaps blood magic, but he didn't care. For someone who had sworn to protect the king at the cost of his own life, there had long been only one concern: Enar's safety. To that end, he also wanted to possess the same power as Titus, Sigismund, and Lyta. Enar certainly noticed everyone's expressions and showed a satisfied look. Although human greed had its drawbacks, he had to admit that the desire to progress was what had led humans to dominate the planet in the short space of hundreds of thousands of years. So Enar was very pleased with everyone's desire to become stronger, especially Rhaenys and Visenya, who were his wives. Both women had to be strong to carry his sons and daughters. Otherwise, the child would kill its mother in the womb before it was even born. Despite everyone's thoughts, Enar finally saw a pair of doors at the end of the corridor. Smiling, he knew he had reached his final destination. When the gates to the Great Hall opened, Enar walked in, smiling as he looked around. Rhaenys and Visenya were at his side, along with the entire royal guard, positioned around the royal family. "Forgive me for intruding, Lord Walder." Enar turned his gaze back to the main seat, where an ugly, weasel-like old man could be seen calmly sipping the wine from his glass. "Very rude, I must say," Walder replied in a cold, calm voice. His eyes looked so deep that they would easily frighten a child. Enar just laughed at Walder's frightened look. He had already seen things infinitely more terrifying than the mere gaze of an ordinary human. "What can I say? I like to enter with pomp, it shows my status as king," Enar commented, looking around. He could see soldiers on the second floor of the Great Hall holding bows and arrows, all aimed at his entourage, especially at him. "You're arrogant. Even in the face of imminent death, you still seem calm," Walder couldn't help but comment, with a touch of sarcasm and cruelty. He raised his hand, signaling for the archers to stand at the ready to fire their arrows. "You need a lot more than mere arrows to kill me," Enar replied with an equally sarcastic tone. He wasn't scared in the slightest. Arrows? Even if they were missiles, he could still get away without being hurt, let alone by mere arrows. Besides, he had Titus, Sigismund, and Lyta protecting him. The arrows wouldn't even come close to hitting him with these three by his side. "Do you think you're a god like Arion?" Walder said with a hint of contempt for Enar's actions. "Are you going to drink wildfire too?" Although I must say that Arion was stupid, he wouldn't die even if he drank a barrel of wildfire. "But thank you for your concern for my health, Lord Walder." Enar's heartfelt words made Rhaenys and Visenya burst out laughing. "Humph!" Walder snorted coldly. It was the first time he had met someone who wasn't ashamed to speak such absurd words so naturally. "You say that, but if I put my hand down, you and your wives will die in an instant," Walder commented with a smile, showing his missing teeth and a few rotten ones. "You can order them to shoot. I want to see your smug, arrogant expression gradually disappear, until only the purest despair remains." The smile on Enar's face disappeared, replaced by a cold, penetrating gaze. Even though he didn't want to admit it, that look frightened Walder's old heart. He felt as if he were facing a predator ready to kill him at any moment. It unnerved him deeply. For some reason, a bad feeling arose in his chest. It was as if an invisible hand was gripping his heart tightly and squeezing it, causing intense discomfort. Without any hesitation, Walder decided to put an end to the source of his discomfort. He lowered his hand. The moment his hand was lowered, the archers fired their arrows. At such close range, none of the archers could miss. Chapter 153, Battle of the Crossing 6. Under everyone's shocked eyes, Titus, Sigismund, and Lyta moved around Enar, Rhaenys, and Visenya. They drew their own swords and rebounded each arrow launched towards the royal family with inhuman speed. After 2 minutes, when all the archers had ceased firing, Enar wiped the dust from his shoulder and spoke in an amused tone. "Did anyone feel anything?" Rhaenys, knowing that Enar wanted to provoke Walder, replied with an innocent tone. "No, everything seemed normal. You may begin, Lord Walder." Enar said, looking at Walder with an encouraging gaze as if telling him to do his best. Silence spread throughout the great hall. No one found Enar and Rhaenys' jokes funny. Everyone stared wide-eyed at Titus, Sigismund and Leda, all three of whom, at 2 meters tall, looked like monsters in front of normal people. Magic, Walder commented sarcastically. You think you can rule Westeros with blood magic, creating human chimeras? In his eyes, the 3 people in front of him were just that, human chimeras made from the blood magic of old Valyria. Like any noble house that had survived for thousands of years, House Frey was no stranger to the practices of the extinct Valyrian Empire. How rude of you. My guards are not chimeras. Enar seemed genuinely offended that Walder had called his guards that. How could mere chimeras compare to the blood ritual that he had personally adapted over almost 3 years? The Lord of the Crossing's words were a pure insult to the masterpieces he had created. You don't even deny that you made them with blood magic. Walder smiled happily. Although I will die, you will never have the support of the faith of the 7. You'll be a king who isn't recognized by the dominant religion. I'll wait for you in hell while I watch from there the rebellions that will take place in your kingdom under the manipulation of the church. Honestly, Enar had to admire Walder's choice of words. Everything the old lord had said would happen sooner or later, including the rebellions orchestrated by the faith of the 7. There was no stopping something like that. The faith was deeply rooted in the people of the 7 kingdoms, at least in southern Westeros. Religion was a weapon in the High Septan's hands, and he could use it to incite the people to fight against the evil king who uses blood magic. You're right, the faith of the 7 will never accept me. But I never said I wanted the support of that incompetent religion. Enar smiled and commented in an amused tone, seeing for the first time the expression of disbelief on Walder Frey's face. You're crazy. Crazier than Ares for thinking you can fight the faith of the 7 with dragons and beings made of blood magic. Maegor tried, but he died on the Iron Throne. Walder Frey couldn't help but laugh shrilly, full of sarcasm in Enar's direction. The boy was more insane than his own grandfather. Who in their right mind would dare fight against a religion that has been around for almost 7 millennia? The faith of the 7 was so ingrained in the people that anything the peasants won or lost was attributed to the god of the 7 faces. How do you fight something like that? Would he kill all the people and leave only the children? But such an idea was so absurd that Walder looked at Enar as if he were facing a madman. Leda, Titus, and Sigismund. Enar ignored Walder's gaze and turned to his 3 faithful knights. Kill them all, but leave the children alive. Yes, your grace. The 3 replied before advancing against everyone present. What followed was a pure, brutal, and indifferent massacre. Leda, Titus, and Sigismund accepted Enar's order without any hesitation. Each stroke of their swords claimed a life. There was no resistance or exchange of blows from their enemies. No one even had the chance to fight 3 monsters. Rhaenys couldn't help feeling a little sorry for the women, listening to their pleas for mercy, but she soon felt a soft hand grasp hers. She looked to the side and saw Visenya, who was staring at her with a calm gaze. Don't feel sorry. Only our family is worthy of our feelings. Visenya commented, watching the massacre before her with indifference. Rhaenys remembered Enar's words and calmed down. The worry in her eyes disappeared. She just watched in silence as dozens of deaths took place at that moment. Her aunt was right. Other people would show no mercy to her family, especially House Frey, who had planned to poison everyone. Anyone who threatened her family should die, regardless of gender, age, or status. Rhaenys even wanted to kill the children, who were probably in their rooms at the time. As someone who had suffered the same fate, she knew exactly that these children would grow up with a deep hatred. So it was better to cut the roots to avoid unnecessary problems. Enar pursed her lips as she noticed the small movements of Rhaenys and Visenya. Watching them both grow was gratifying. The future would not be kind to House Targaryen. And all of House Targaryen needed determination in times of need. To hesitate before the Chaos Gods was to ask to die. Walder Frey watched with grief as all his sons and daughters died at the hands of the aberrations made from blood magic. Blood stained the walls, floor and ceiling, heads and limbs rolled on the blood-soaked floor. In mere minutes, the accumulation of almost 90 years disappeared in front of him. Even though Walder didn't care so much about these sons and daughters, he couldn't help but feel sadness and a touch of regret. He, who had always been cautious, had become greedy in the face of the benefits given by Tywin. Putting a few drops of poison in the cup, Walder didn't hesitate to drink the poison while looking at the bodies of his sons and daughters. "It seems you want to die with honor." Hearing the Targaryen boy's words, Walder smiled sarcastically and toasted towards Enar, as if inviting him to drink the same wine as him. "This is not out of honor, but out of cowardice, the fear of being tortured day and night," he replied with an indifferent tone. He felt no shame in talking about his own fears in the face of the enemy who had destroyed his noble house. "Fear kills the soul and poisons your determination," Enar commented, walking towards Walder with a calm tone. "That same fear led you to this moment. If you'd stuck to your convictions, you'd still be alive." Convictions. Walder chewed on that word and smiled miserably. "I lost my convictions when I was just a child who was always despised for being too ugly by the lords and ladies at the parties I attended." As his body gradually lost its warmth and sense of touch, Walder looked at Enar and spoke with a terribly calm and cold tone. "We'll meet in the Seven Hells, Targaryen boy." Enar smiled and replied cheerfully. "I shall look forward to our reunion, Lord Frey." Walder didn't reply. His body relaxed completely as the light in his eyes went out. "A death worthy of a coward," Visenya commented with a touch of sarcasm at the sight of Walder's lifeless body. She approached and pushed the corpse aside, leaving the main seat free so that Enar could sit down whenever he wanted. "Ser Barristan, cut off his head and place it so that all may see the fate of those who plot against House Targaryen," Visenya ordered with a cold tone. Her gentleness and warmth were reserved only for her family. "Yes, my queen." Barristan didn't hesitate. Although he didn't approve of indiscriminate slaughter, he was a royal guard, and obedience came before principle. "I'm proud of you both." Enar spoke with a cheerful air, despite being surrounded by corpses and blood on all sides. He kissed both women on the cheek and looked at them with a gaze full of appreciation. Visenya and Rhaenys rolled their eyes but smiled when they heard the pride in Enar's words. "I have completed the mission, Your Grace." Leda, Titus and Sigismund knelt before Enar and replied in cold, calm voices. Looking at the three of them covered head to toe in blood, Enar smiled and didn't hesitate to praise them all with pride. "Well done everyone, especially Titus and Sigismund, you've become very powerful while I've been away." Both his primarchs were much more powerful than before. They had grown and become incredibly strong. "I will become even stronger to protect you, my king." Titus spoke, while Sigismund, the quietest of the brothers, nodded and looked at Enar with a determined gaze. "You will be of great help against the dark forces to come, my primarchs." Enar only smiled and spoke in a gentler tone, looking at them both. They both beat their chests and shouted loudly, "Yes, my king." Chapter 154, War of the Four Kings. Enar sat in the main seat of the Great Hall of Twins and looked out at his court, which filled every seat. Although the corpses and blood had been removed, the smell of blood still hung subtly in the air. "Now that we've conquered Twins, let's start dividing the armies," Enar said to everyone. His eyes were calmer than ever. "I'll go to the Vale of Arryn, while Rhaenys and Visenya will go to the Riverlands," Enar said and continued. "Oberyn and Tyrion will follow my queen and sister, along with the entire Red Legion, to face the army of houses Baratheon and Lannister in the Riverlands." Honestly, Enar was speechless at the misfortune of the Riverlands region. It was one of the most fertile and prosperous in Westeros, but because it was the battleground for almost every war on the continent, it suffered enormously from consecutive conflicts. Now, once again, the Riverlands would be the scene of another battle. Although this was due to its geographical position and flat terrain, excellent for the cavalry to march on, Enar lamented the region's bad luck. "Lord Stark and the Northern Army will follow me into the Vale." Enar spoke, looking at Eddard with a calm gaze. The reason he had brought Eddard and his army was simple. His uncle had grown up in the Vale and would be of great help in mobilizing the troops due to his familiarity with the terrain. Eddard nodded and let out a sigh filled with complex emotions. He had never thought that one day he would conquer the Vale. Remembering his childhood, the Lord of Winterfell's mood turned even darker. However, Eddard knew he couldn't back down at that moment, not when things were so far advanced. He had to continue with what he had agreed to do, not just for Enar's sake, but to keep his family, who were still in Winterfell, safe. "Yes, Your Grace." Eddard, Oberyn and Tyrion stood up and accepted Enar's orders without any hesitation. Oberyn and Tyrion seemed especially excited for the war, Tyrion in particular. After learning that Jaime was leading House Lannister's army, he wanted to leave for the Riverlands as soon as possible. He really wanted to see the look on Jaime's face when he met him. Although he loved his brother, his hatred and resentment of Jaime and Tywin outweighed any affection he might feel for his lying brother. Noticing the tense atmosphere of the place and the lust of many for war, Enar raised his wine glass and spoke aloud. "Let's party to celebrate 2 victories in a row." "Party? I am Great John. Who dare say he can drink more ale than me?" The Lord of House Umber spoke out loud. He looked at all the men with an arrogant and proud look. "I want to see if you're as strong as they say, Southerner." Tormund was the first to stand up at Greatjon's brazen provocation. Mance let out a tired sigh, anticipating how things would turn out. Enar smiled at the sight of the 2 men, both imposing, starting a drinking contest. If there was one thing the men of the North knew how to do, it was to party at the slightest opportunity. Living in a cold and inhospitable region, the people had learned to be direct and express themselves as they pleased. Enar sipped his wine and observed everything with a calm gaze. As king, it wasn't appropriate for him to join in the festivities himself. With him present, people didn't feel comfortable enough to relax completely. So instead of joining his vassals, Enar remained in the main seat, watching everyone enjoy the victory with a serene gaze. "A king is naturally lonely," Enar muttered, remembering what Visenya I Targaryen had told him on the 7th day of his training, when he was only 6 years old. At the time, he didn't understand her words, but now, feeling the distance between him and the others, he understood perfectly what she meant. Just as Enar was about to take another sip of wine, he felt someone grab his hand. He looked over and saw Visenya, his wife, staring at him with a lovely, gentle gaze. "It's not as lonely as you said, Queen Visenya." Enar smiled and murmured, genuine warmth reflecting in her eyes. "You looked lonely even though you were the center of the whole party." Visenya whispered with a warm, gentle tone. She squeezed his hand tighter and smiled sweetly. "For a moment I thought I was lonely, but then I realized that I have beautiful wives. How could I feel like that?" Enar joked as he kissed her hand with a gentle touch of his lips. "You incorrigible womanizer." Visenya grumbled with a hint of dissatisfaction, but the smile on her lips betrayed the happiness she felt at that moment. "You're becoming more and more adept at persuading women." Enar laughed when he heard this. He had witnessed millions of timelines. It would be strange if he didn't know how to talk to a woman. After the party was over, Enar saw that everyone was drunk. Tormund and Greatjon in particular were unconscious on the floor. They had both drunk so much that he assumed they would wake up with the worst headache of their lives. Shaking his head, Enar decided to retire to his room, leaving the others still drinking and chatting casually. Just as Visenya was about to follow Enar, she felt someone grab her arm and saw Rhaenys looking at her with a mysterious look. "Auntie, sleep with me tonight. Tell me about your days in Essos." Rhaenys spoke gently, with a look of admiration on her face. Visenya, who still didn't understand what was about to happen, felt proud to see the admiration in her niece's eyes and nodded. Enar was going to sleep anyway, so she wasn't worried about him. Looking at Enar's back, Rhaenys smiled mysteriously and whispered, "With Visenya out of the way, Arianne will get what she wants." "Did you say something, niece?" Visenya asked curiously, not having heard Rhaenys' words very well. "It's nothing, I was just whispering about how heroic my aunt is, Visenya's second coming in the world." Rhaenys quickly changed the subject and spoke with a look of admiration, making Visenya feel extremely proud. When Enar was about to enter the room to rest, she stopped for a moment, a curious look appearing on her face. His senses were alerting him that there was someone in the room. His lips lifted in an amused smile. "Everyone can stand by outside the room," he said, and then looked at Lita. "Lita, you can come in." The royal guards didn't hesitate to accept the king's order. They positioned themselves beside and in front of the door, ready for anything. Titus and Sigismund looked like iron walls protecting the entrance to the room. Opening the door, Enar let Lita in first and then closed it with an amused smile. Lita didn't mind the room. Her gray eyes quickly fell on the figure on the bed. She was an incredibly beautiful woman, with olive skin and black eyes, as well as her slightly curly hair falling over her naked body. There was a sensual smile on her lips and a seductive look in her eyes. "Your Grace is very popular with women." Recognizing the Sunspear heiress, Lita commented with a touch of sarcasm. "Did I sense a slight jealousy in your voice, Lita?" Enar asked with a provocative tone as he looked at the naked woman on the bed he was going to use that night. Arianne certainly knew how to seduce a man. It's just your imagination, your grace. Lita replied without hesitation, with a calm look on her face. Jealousy? She was a sword. What was the point of being jealous? Besides, after a year and a half with Enar, she knew very well that her king liked to tease her. How could she fall for his teasing after so much time spent together? Enar couldn't help but be dissatisfied with Lita's expression. He loved to tease her. How could he be satisfied with such a lack of reaction? Arianne was speechless to see the two of them chatting casually, as if she wasn't there. However, far from feeling insulted, she found the scene incredibly funny. It was the first time she had seen Enar act so relaxed, even childish. And she had to admit it. She preferred this gentler, more playful side of him. At that moment he was Enar the man. Not Enar the king. The former was approachable, kind and fun. The second was cold, calm, indifferent and regal. Both were Enar, but she preferred him in his more human state. Hearing Arianne's laughter, Enar looked at the Princess of Dorne with a smile and said, I must be very blessed to have such a beautiful sight as soon as I enter my chambers. Arianne just laughed and replied sensually, I'm cold, your grace. You see, Lita? I have to be a good man and warm up the beautiful princess. Enar looked innocently at Lita and spoke with a tone full of chivalry and justice. Lita looked at Enar speechlessly. If you want to sleep with her, just say so. Don't pretend to be a fair and honorable knight. Snorting coldly, Lita refused to answer the king, who clearly had no sense of shame. Chapter 155, War of the Four Kings 2. The next morning. Don't go, my king. Arianne hugged Enar from behind, pressing her naked body against his back. Her whisper sounded like that of a demon, inducing people to fall into the arms of hell. She bit his ear and continued with her devilish, seductive whispers. Let me help you calm your desires, my beautiful king. Enar couldn't help but feel ready for battle again. The desert princess knew exactly how to excite him. At the same time, he was speechless. That had been his and Arianne's first time, but one was more abnormal than the other. While Enar didn't seem to get tired, Arianne also showed infinite energy. Aren't you tired? Bringing the woman into the shelter of his arms, Enar couldn't help but ask, curious. He knew very well the power of his own body. During the night when he had been with Arianne, he had held back as much as he could, but even a fraction of his strength was not something to be taken lightly. I'm exhausted. Arianne rested her head on his shoulder and answered softly. Her eyes were fixed on his face, and a tired but seductive smile played across his slightly swollen lips. But I have to serve my king. Arianne continued, her voice sweet and engaging. To fulfill my goals, my ambitions and my desires, I must make sure that my king never forgets this night. Enar looked at the woman in his arms with a calm gaze. However, he smiled and whispered in her ear, You are my first wife. There's no forgetting you, my ambitious serpent. A smile appeared on Arianne's lips as she heard this. She had already realized the night before that, like her, he was inexperienced. But your grace is a quick learner. She couldn't help but comment, her cheeks flushing as she remembered some embarrassing positions. Feeling pride inflate in his heart, Enar was speechless. Men were incredibly easy to be proud of, especially when they received compliments from a woman as beautiful and high status as Arianne. What's more, he had won her purity, which increased his feeling of victory even more. Doran will be really furious if he finds out about your plans, little snake. Enar said with an amused smile. How could he not know about Arianne's ambitions? He had known about them for a long time and had never cared. Does your grace know? Arianne asked, with a slightly surprised tone. But seeing no antipathy or disgust on his face, she relaxed completely in his arms. At that moment, snuggled against that strong, broad and powerful chest, she felt safer than ever. Arianne wondered if this was how every woman in the world felt when she snuggled up to a man's chest. But she knew that was impossible. It wasn't just because of the loss of her virginity that she felt that way, but because it was Enar himself, a man who made any danger in the world seem insignificant in front of him. My father doesn't want to give me what is rightfully mine, so I have to take it myself. Arianne didn't hide her purpose and spoke directly. She knew that lies led to mistrust and then death, something she didn't want. So she was completely honest. If I have a child with white hair and purple eyes, no matter how reluctant the lords of Dorne are, they will have to accept that I am the ruler of Dorne. Arianne smiled. Although her body was practically begging for rest, she was ready for another round with Enar. Enar couldn't help but twitch his lips when he heard her words. Daeron, don't blame your father for the circumstances of your birth. Your mother is too ambitious and wants to use you to control the lords of Dorne. He thought, slightly regretting the future of his fourth son. Not that anything bad was going to happen to the boy, but having his birth decided on the basis of conspiracies was not a good thing. Feeling her soft, naked, seductive body against his, Enar controlled his own desires and gently caressed Arianne's face. Our son won't be able to have a dragon, but he will have a strength that no human has ever had. Enar spoke with a gentle tone, as his finger slid softly over the desert princess's luscious lips. Arianne's eyes lit up when she heard his words. She didn't care about the promise itself, but about his permission for her to have his child. Arianne knew she couldn't have Enar's child without his permission. After all, it was very simple for him to order her to drink the moon tea. But with his consent, she could become pregnant without any hindrance. With the support of her son and Enar, the sun throne of Dorne would be hers, and no one could take it from her. Thank you, my king. Arianne smiled innocently like a child and kissed Enar's lips deeply. Suddenly, the door opened, causing Arianne to stop what she was doing and look back. Seeing Visenya's gloomy expression, the desert princess smiled gently at her lover's lawful wife. Enar looked at Lita with a helpless look. He hadn't expected Lita to be so vengeful. Noticing the king's gaze, Lita smiled sarcastically at him and stood still, indifferent to his accusatory look. This was her revenge for Enar forcing her to listen to them having sex all night. Visenya crossed her arms under her breasts and watched the scene before her with a touch of anger. She wanted to slap herself on the cheek for having fallen for such an obvious and low trick. Even she hadn't expected Rhaenys to help Arianne. Looks like a fun night. Visenya looked at Arianne, naked on Enar's lap, and snorted coldly. That was her place, but now it was occupied by an ambitious, lustful snake. Arianne got off Enar's lap, put on her clothes, kissed his cheek and left with a happy smile on her lips. No matter what happened today, she had achieved her goal after years. Nothing could shake her happiness. Putting her hair back, Enar greeted his wife with a gentle smile. Good morning, Vi. Visenya snorted arrogantly, but she already knew from the conversation a few days ago that Enar had lovers. So she wasn't that upset about it. What really annoyed her was that she had fallen for such an obvious trick. Just as her younger sister had said, she really was innocent. Good morning, my lovely husband beyond repair. Visenya greeted Enar with a disgruntled look. Well, Dorne is ours completely. Enar spoke, standing up without bothering to display his nakedness in front of Visenya and Lita. Visenya nodded. Now that Arianne was Enar's lover, there was no way Dorne could escape the hands of House Targaryen. Best of all, there was no bloodshed or hatred, although there was probably some resentment on the part of Doran's sons. But they were irrelevant in the face of the benefits that House Targaryen had received. Doran will be livid with rage when he learns of Arianne's plans. Helping Enar clean himself with a wet cloth, Visenya commented with a smile. From Enar's description, she knew how Doran acted and looked. The man would certainly be furious, but helpless in the face of the power grab. There was no resisting House Targaryen, especially Enar, who, in Visenya's eyes, was practically a god. The army is ready for departure. Everyone is waiting for you to give your motivational speech. Visenya reminded Enar that the whole army, including her, was about to leave for the Riverlands. Enar nodded and said, When you get to the Riverlands, you can have all the fun you want. Enar's words were translated as follows for Visenya: Burn anyone who dares not surrender. Have as much fun as you want. The young woman's eyes practically glowed with excitement. It was the first time she would use Syrax in a real battle, a battle where she would rain down fire and blood on the enemy. Seeing Visenya's excitement, Enar smiled. Like any Targaryen, she was brave, and fire ran through her veins without any fear of war. That pleased him. You may fear war, but you must never back down in the face of it.